Well, this is Mental Health Radio. Take it from us, and that's our theme music from Sarita Murdoch's Many Lines. I'm Sheldon Brown, and we are funded by Framework. Today we talk to a mental health consumer who has spent more than a decade looking out for the welfare of others with experience of mental health and representing their interests. Gary Sutcliffe, who retired at the end of last month after 13 years working in mental health, has held a diverse range of roles from management to promoting mental and physical wellness. Gary and I have, in fact, worked together on the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, and as a couple of old farts, we seem
to... Yourself?
Yeah, speak for us. Yes, exactly. Who said you were allowed to speak up? We had a great time introducing some of the concepts of wellness recovery to many, many clients. So let's hear from Gary about his experiences working in mental health and whether his expectations have been met. Welcome, Gary, again to Mental Health Radio. Take it from us.
Thanks,
Was your move into mental health accidental, or did it result from your own personal experience of depression and anxiety?
Yeah, look, it was actually was an intentional move on my part. I had been involved voluntarily in the sector for about 5 years, mainly as part of Te Ata, the West Auckland Mental Health Support Trust, but also I was connected with Walsh Trust out in the West and Waitakere Health Link. So really it was the tender age of 55. I chose to take a pretty sharp right-hand turn in my working life, and I really wanted to... If I wanted to make a bigger difference, I wanted to look to see if I could actually work in the mental health sector.
Yeah. But, I mean, you were in the retail business, weren't you? The retail sporting business. Did that volunteer work with Te Ata and others in the West, had that started before you finished your retail business?
Well, yeah, the ultimate failure of my retail business was the beginning of my crash, basically. So I closed the business down in 1992, 93, and still worked through it. I mean, I first became unwell in 1991 when the wheels were falling off. So, yeah, it came after that, really, as part of my recovery, really. Yeah.
So I guess it was a bit of a double whammy that the wheels were falling off your mental health and also off the business. I mean, what was that like?
Yeah, well... crap. It was pretty bad. It was just that feeling of total loss of confidence, out of control. You know, it was, I crashed before the business did, but an old friend of mine kind of pointed to the writing on the wall in a very kind, compassionate way. And he actually said, Gary, your business is struggling and you need to get a job. And so basically he helped to guide me in that direction. So I found a job, not really feeling like doing it, but I did it, and it was a pretty high-powered job as well. So, yeah.
But that wasn't in mental health. That was
that was still in the sports industry. I mean, my start to working in the sports industry is when I bought the business, and it was great for the first 5 years before things started to unravel. But yeah, that was the start of about nearly 20 years in the sports industry.
So, as you say, you had to do a bit of a right turn, a bit like me. I was in public relations consulting and eventually working for myself, which ended up to be pretty soul-destroying. And I suppose it was somewhat accidental that I got into mental health. But so you sort of had a incubation period, I suppose, did you, of volunteering? Did that volunteering come through the fact that you needed help yourself and you were introduced to services?
Well, Yeah, well, it's interesting. Back in 91, when I went to my GP and he diagnosed sort of a depression, and when he tried to help me through some medications and suggested counselling and stuff like that, it didn't really work. And he said, look, the only thing, I can't prescribe any stronger medication, which is all it came down to really for him, is I'm going to have to refer you to a psychiatrist. Now, at no point did he even talk about mental health services. I don't know what the hell mental health services were like in 1991. I'm sure they existed, but all my thoughts were the likes of the place that we're sitting now is Carrington and Oakley and Kingseat. It was kind of like, man, it was scary stuff. And
they would have been at the verge of closing down around about then.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So community mental health started, I think, Framework started about 1984, and I don't think they were probably a front runner, but there must have been others, because it was a government initiative, wasn't it, to move out of the psychiatric bins. But I had exactly the same experience, because I was probably experiencing some of my mental health challenges in the 1990s, and nobody, absolutely nobody, said to me, well, there are community mental health services out there.
Yeah. Counsellors was about it. Look, we can recommend some counselling, and it was kind of like, okay, that's counselling, and it didn't work for me.
Did you get involved in community mental health? You know, like the traditional community mental health centres?
Well, only later on in life, actually, in 2006, when I changed my medication regime, and around about that time it was recommended that I connect then, so I was actually referred to mental health services about 15 years after my first incidents of depression, and that was around struggling a bit with the change of medication. But that was a brief encounter, really. It was a couple of sessions with a psychiatrist and some other health professional, and I think I was probably discharged within 3 months, so I probably had one or two visits and got onto another medication regime, and where I went. Yeah.
But I mean, that is the backbone of mental health services, isn't it? Those community mental health centres. So you didn't really get to know about them until, 15 years after your first incident?
I was probably aware of them in the later 90s, only because when I started to do some voluntary work, and Te Ata, of course, was not sponsored by, whatever, funded by Waitemata DHB, and so I became a little bit aware of how some of those services work. Didn't know very much, but it was more than I knew before.
Yeah, and I think you became a director of Te Ata, didn't you?
I was on the board for 14 years. I went initially, I went into the place when I read a little article in the paper and said that this new centre was opening in Henderson Valley for people experiencing mental health issues. So I kind of eventually found somebody to contact and said, look, I'd like to help in some way. I don't know how, but I want to help. And the first time I met with somebody, said, look, we're really looking for board members, consumers on the board. And so I said, look, anything. I didn't even have a clue what it was all about, really, but said, look, anything to help. And so that was the start of 13 or 14 years of
involvement
being on the board and the governance of Te Ata, yeah.
Yeah, so Te Ata is a creative space which is sort of equivalent to Toiora Live Arts, isn't it? Yeah,
it was kind of like Toiora was like the parent, really, and started us off in that creative space back then in around 98, 99, yeah.
And did there remain a good link between the two creative spaces?
Yeah, I think it probably stretched a bit over time. I mean, initially we engaged some of the same tutors, the art tutors and so on from Toiora would come over and take some sessions, but I think that, yeah, it just, I guess the apron strings were cut, I don't mean, not unkindly, in a self-determination way. It was all good.
So they both ended up in their own little silos, which can so often happen in mental health.
Possibly did, although one was sort of pretty much west-based, and Te Ata was kind of had a wider range of programs supporting people, whereas Toyora very much is about bringing the creativity out in people in so many different ways.
Yeah. Did you ever get involved in creativity as a therapy for your own mental health?
Sheldon, my extent of creativity is drawing stick figures, and the only bit of creativity I think I've ever had is in writing, and I don't mean writing novels or anything, but it's actually like, as you do, writing reports and papers and actually really focusing on those being easy to read. But, creativity wasn't one thing that I really put in my wellness toolbox.
Well, it's something that I didn't think I had. I certainly didn't have it at school or in art class, but it was something that I discovered. And you've got a beautiful piece of bone carving hanging around your neck, and of course that was really one of the foundations of my recovery, was learning bone carving at Framework. And of course I met the CEO, the then CEO of Framework, in the bone carving school, and that led on to me becoming consumer marketing and promotions leader.
As they say, is history.
Well, to some extent. Yeah. But I think that creativity that I uncovered while in hospital has led on to me at least appreciating art and buying quite a bit of mental art from mental health people with lived experience.
After my initial kind of drop into the depths of the depression, I had a couple of crash and burns, and one of them was in the job that I went to while my business was being wound down by a really good friend of mine, and he did a wonderful job that I could never have done. I sort of, around the mid-90s, it happened again, so I was unemployed for about 9 or 10 months or something, and that's really all what I had to fall back on, really, was that. And I'm glad I had that, because without that I could very well have completely withdrawn, and who knows how my life would have been. So yes, it was a what do you call it, a lifesaver.
Yeah. That track, Respect Yourself, Gary. I mean, respect for ourselves and for others is so critical, isn't it?
Well, yeah, because I know for me that I kind of pretty much lost my own self-respect really around that time, because I felt such a failure, and it was, I just, I didn't know how to love myself. I didn't know how to respect myself. It was kind of like, I'd let everybody else down, and, it was a difficult thing to reclaim, but it is one of those things that, as I got better and I understood what was really important in my life, and probably right at the top of the tree is really respecting myself and who I am and so on. So it was, it is pretty big.
I mean, I'd venture to say there's a great deal of respect in the mental health community for Gary Sutcliffe, because you've just mentioned to me that you've been invited on to a new initiative with the Waitemata District Health Board. You've worked for Framework, East Tamaki Healthcare, for the Regional Consumer Network. I think you've really built up a great deal of respect in the mental health sector.
Oh, it's really good of you to say that, Sheldon. It's I feel really privileged to have pretty much every role that I've had, although some of them haven't turned out quite so good, but I've actually respected the fact I've had the opportunity to contribute in that way. Yeah.
And I think you've shown respect to people with lived experience, which I guess to some extent was the whole reason why you went into mental health.
Well, it was too, and I sort of went into it with rose-coloured glasses, really, in some ways, because I really had very little idea of what the real life was like for people experiencing mental illness, apart from me and my own experience and some of the people I may have come in contact with at Taiata. So, it was a big learning curve.
Yeah, but I mean, what you've just described as feeling a failure, losing your love for yourself, respect, letting other people down, I mean, that experience gives you huge credibility when you're trying to help other people with lived experience.
I think it did in the end, and I actually believe that it did in the end too. I didn't want to sort of feel that was the case right from the start, because it sounded a bit egotistical, but I firmly believe that is a big factor in making those positive connections with people, and that thing about just being authentic and and having that empathy and understanding.
Well, I think that when you and I worked together on the Wellness Recovery Action Planning workshops, and we did that probably for over 2 years together, and I always felt that when we told our stories that there was an element of surprise in the room, that, a couple of people who appeared to be pretty together might have fooled most of the people.
Not too much together, Sheldon.
No, well, not that sort of together, but together from a mental health and physical health point of view.
For sure.
I think that that added credibility in the room and probably added respect both ways, But, over these years, what have you learnt about getting well and staying well?
Medication was the thing, and then I eventually discovered the medication that was starting to help. But actually, that was what I found in the long run, was that was just a small part, really. And prior to my crash, really, in 1991, I'd run about 10 marathons, and in those marathons, it was kind of my watch as much as anything that determined how good my marathon was.
Your watch?
My watch, the time.
I see, right.
The time was kind of the factor, and when I completed my first marathon after that crash, which was in early 92, it wasn't one of my best times, but crossing the finish line took on a whole new meaning for me, and it was the journey that mattered, not the finishing time. And I think that's what I've learned over the years, is it's the journey and what you learn. And but I have to say, you talked about rap before. I discovered rap in 2006. I may have known about it a little bit before that, but I actually got into rap in 2006, and I wrote my first rap plan. And what that helped me was to make me realise what was really important in my life, as well as recognising things like my triggers and early warning signs, and what I could do by way of actions to minimise the impact of those. So,
but I mean, being able to run a marathon, say 12 months after having a pretty serious meltdown, I mean, wasn't that a huge achievement? And maybe you didn't satisfy yourself in terms of your watch, in terms of the time that you ran, but I mean, even being able to access the energy to do that after a meltdown only 12 months earlier.
Yeah, it was probably about 9 months, really. But what happened is that, something I forced myself to do was to get out and just get out, because I had been running quite a lot up till then, obviously, and it was a big part of my life. But I'd still force myself to get out of bed, out of the house, get out and go. Look, sometimes I'd get a few hundred metres up the road and I'd be bawling my eyes out and say, I don't want to be here, I don't want to be anywhere, and I'd turn around and go home again. And I just gradually, as some of the medication started to kick in a little bit, I'd then get out and I'd start running a bit more. And I mean, to do a marathon anyway, you can't do it without training and spending hours on the road. So I gradually sort of got into a program, into sort of a training program I'd become familiar with. So when I got to the start line, I was physically reasonably ready for it, and but it was a different mental challenge. Yeah,
I mean, when you got to the start line of mental health challenges, it's not an easy place to be. Do you think it's a harder place to be than being on the start line of a marathon?
Oh, way more. And I think with the marathon, you get to start line, so being prepared to get there to start, and then knowing what you've got in front of you. It's 42 Ks. There's no short marathons. It's 42 Ks and a bit. And it was knowing that there was a starting point and a finish point, and there was a finish line. And that was the goal. I mean, they say in marathons that it's one of those events where finishing is winning. Yes, there is going to be some people who are going to win it and win their age groups, but actually just crossing the line is an accomplishment. But it just felt double the accomplishment when I did that first one again in 92. Yeah.
Well, what did you learn, though, about that marathon running in terms of, transferring that onto your life with experience of mental health? I mean, I heard you say that you would force yourself to. Do you think using force to try and address your mental health challenge is a good idea?
Well, probably not, but more discipline. I think it was sort of more of a discipline thing, and I guess I innately knew that physical exercise was good for me, and good for anybody really, and just working towards that. I mean, it had become such a big part of my life, for the previous 7 years or however long it was that I'd run those 10 marathons. And
well, you've got a polo shirt on saying Rotorua Marathon Survivors Club 20 years.
20 years. I wore it deliberately because I'd hoped you'd pick up on that one, Sheldon. That was actually my last marathon in 2014. It was also the Rotorua Marathon's 50th marathon. And I just, when it came to sort of working some numbers out and some goals some years ago, I sort of thought, I'd like to do my 20th marathon around the course, which is going to the next phase of the Survivors Club on their biggest event for some time, the 50th. So, which I did, and that was my last one. It may finish up being my last one too.
So what are some of the other things? I mean, I guess, exercise clearly has been a major factor. I guess it gets the old adrenaline going, the serotonin going, and that sort of thing. Did you get a lift on those days where you were able to persist with your run or your walk? When you got home, did you feel a lift?
Oh, for sure. Look, I think there's only probably been one or two marathons out of all the ones I've done where I've crossed the finish line and sort of thought to myself, I didn't really enjoy that. I mean, the word enjoyment in marathons, you probably sort of think the guy is crazy. But it was that sense of achievement. It was always a good feeling, and with the recovery, there's kind of like that glow. Is that, what do they call it? That pain and pleasure kind of thing together.
Yeah.
The body's hurting like hell, but I feel so good about it.
There's no gain without pain.
Yeah, probably in this case, you're right.
At any stage when you were seeing GPs and psychiatrists and maybe community mental health centres, did you hear the word recovery?
No, not in those early stages. My GP and my psychiatrist said that, that the medications will help me feel better. And they possibly told psychiatrists definitely would have talked about some other things that might help. I don't know whether the word recovery was actually mentioned as such. I probably first heard about recovery when I started working in mental health, and at that stage there was at the beginning of a focus on recovery. But as I did the rap and I met a lot of other people, what I came to realise is that recovery is what it is for Sheldon, or for Gary. It's what recovery is for me, is what it is for me. It's not what other people's perception of recovery is, or whether they think I've recovered. The last 3 years of my working life have been a real pleasure, because initially it started with a conversation with Dr. David Kadaya, who's a really well-known psychiatrist up this way, very well-respected man, and we just happened to have a chat in a plane on the way back from doing sort of an audit or a review of mental health services in one of the other DHBs, and he said, look, I work at East Tamaki Healthcare, and I'm sort of part of a small mental health team. And he said part of my vision is to employ some peer support specialists. And what did I think? And I said, well, you're talking my language, David. So when I joined East Tamaki Healthcare, it was still called the mental health team, and there was David, there was two psychologists, there was a nurse who had specific mental health training, There was myself and my delightful colleague Merle, the other peer support specialist. So I started off with 6 of us, and in the last 3 years, the size of the team, it's now called the Wellness Support Team. It's not the mental health team, although people probably still call it the mental health team. We're the Wellness Support Team. I think the size of that team is somewhere around about 35, 36 people, of which I think 8 are peers. In that, and you talk about the physical health, one of the first things we all did, and we're all qualified to do, is lead the Stanford, it's called the Chronic Disease Self-Management Program, which we don't like the chronic disease aspect to it. We call it the self-management program, and it's for people with long-term conditions.
Physical or mental health.
Yep, whether they be physical or mental, and what I guess I've found over a period of time, or we found at East Tamaki, is that possibly 4 out of 5 people who did that, who came in where their prime, diagnosis may have been diabetes or heart disease or something, that they had a kind of coexisting mental health issues, as well. So, but very much around that program of self-management, which is like self-determination is obviously a big thing in our recovery, but managing our lives better, physically, mentally, just lifestyle.
And you've got a wonderful mindfulness specialist, I think, as part of that team at East Tamaki Healthcare.
Yeah, well, as Lila has led that program for some time, I think there's now about 4, maybe 5 leaders of the mindfulness program that are all engaged under the Nirvana Health, East Tamaki Healthcare umbrella.
So it's really about self-care, isn't it?
Absolutely. Self-care, learning ways in which to manage our lives better. And it's shown that with the RAP, I think we found that one of the most powerful aspects of RAP was in the connection between people, the sharing of experience, the sharing of ideas, and people picking up ideas from other people they hadn't thought about. The same thing with the self-management programs. A very strong part of that is hearing other people speak. I'm not in this alone.